Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Our idea is to discuss the updated environmental and social sustainability framework of the EIB Group. This is a very important topic, and as you all know, the environmental, social, and governance standards are part of what today is called impact or social investment. So very important consideration that goes beyond the usual orientation on profit only. And there's a growing number of investors that include these standards into the assessment framework. And EIB, of course, European Investment Bank Group, the EU bank, is no exception. It's actually on the forefront of these changes and these new considerations. So super that we'll have two experts from the EIB Group today giving us an overview of this updated framework. But before we actually go into the details, let me just say a few words about the program that this webinar is part of. We are organizing it as part of the EaSI technical assistance to the European microcredit sector. EaSI stands for social. It actually stands for social innovation. It is a program that supports microfinance institutions in European Union with technical assistance, but not only with that, as you see in this chart. The left-hand side is devoted and describes the technical assistance program, but also it has a financial component, and this financial component actually has various financial instruments, and including grant support that are aimed at helping MFIs in growing and developing the scale of operations and reaching the right clientele, the right and that is micro entrepreneurs. It is also quite important for you to know that this program also targets social enterprises. So the new edition of EaSI that will start actually next month will also provide technical assistance to providers of finance to social enterprises and to social enterprises. So it's so this program has really grown in importance over the last few years. And maybe if we could go back to the previous slide, I also wanted to say who implements it. There are three institutions implementing the technical assistance part, and that is MFC, that I represent, Frankfurt School of Finance and Management, and also European Microfinance Network. So we are in partnership, and we provide various activities, and I will explain what kind of activities EaSI includes to microfinance providers in Europe. Another institution that is an important player in that is Microfinanza Rating. You can see the abbreviation MFIs. They provide institutional assessments and necessary institutional ratings. So as you can guess, there are two important components to this TA program. One is TA itself. The other one is institutional assessments that actually review the institutional systems, standards, etc., that allow them to perform in the market and eventually to grow. And then I already said that microfinance institutions in EU are recipients of this program, but the end beneficiaries, of course, are micro enterprises and social enterprises in the EU. So now let's move to the next slide. I will quickly also describe what kind of activities and what kind of programs are part of this, are part of EaSI. So on one hand, we have tailored trainings, but also investment readiness trainings. Many microfinance institutions in Europe actually are investment ready and use the support of social investors, but nonetheless there is a group of younger institutions that need this kind of a support so that they can over the time switch from grant sources to more sustainable financing options, and that is to loans or equity. Institutional assessment, I already mentioned that, and with optional financial or social rating. Then another very important component of this program is the European Code of Good Conduct. We'll mention it also today in the context of the ESG, of the EIB's ESG framework. And within EaSI, we can provide training on the implementation of the code. We can evaluate the MFI that would like to apply for the code certification, for code compliance. And also we do post-evaluation trainings for institutions that are attempting another round of certification. And probably the biggest component, the most popular one, is the dissemination of good practices. So we do it via webinars such as this one, but also through all kinds of workshops, peer-to-peer training, study visit, and also there is a help desk that is managed by the European Microfinance Network. So as I already said, the current phase of this program ends pretty soon, end of June. July we'll close it off formally and we'll start a new program, and this new program is called SIFTA. So please watch out for SIFTA, S-I-F-T-A. It actually stands for Social Inclusive Finance Technical Assistance. As I already said, this time this program will also cover social enterprises and the institutions that work with them. So you have some details of the EaSI technical assistance here. So there is a contact email for TA. There is also a separate contact for ratings evaluation, and there is you can also see a link to the website that will direct you to more information about the EaSI program. Let me also say a few words about the upcoming webinars. As I said, we have the final round of these webinars, so the program is quite packed. It will take place, actually all of the webinars will take place on this and the following week. So tomorrow we'll have a webinar on awareness raising on climate issues among microfinance clients. We'll also have a webinar on InvestEU. Many of you probably are familiar with InvestEU. It's a new investment program of the European Commission that follows on the so-called Juncker's plan. It is a robust investment vehicle that also is meant to support institutions, EU companies in post-COVID recovery. And then we also have a webinar on digital identity, and we'll discuss what sort of opportunities exist for MFIs when they use digital identity. I also would like to pitch MFC membership. MFC is a network, and we've been in existence for over 20 years. It's a strong network that covers over 100 institutions in Europe and the former Soviet Union countries. And yes, we also have our conference coming up soon. Actually, the conference will take place next week in Istanbul under the title Microfinance Investing Through Uncertainty. There is still time to register, so please register if you haven't done that yet. I think the deadline is Monday, next week. There will be about 500 people, including a significant group of social investors. So they will also discuss about opportunities to finance microfinance and social finance institution at this crazy time of uncertainty and unpredictability. So they will also discuss this, pretty much the context of working these days. Okay, and let me now ask Joanna to say a few words about the logistics of this webinar. Joanna, over to you.
Okay, a few issues, technical issues. The attendees are muted, and if you want to ask any question, you can use chat. It's here. You can write, and then I read this information, and you can use the icon with hand up, and then we can unmute you. Okay, sorry.
Okay.
That's no. It's only the main issue is that this webinar is recorded.
Okay, and it is recorded not because
we will.
It is recorded, but it's a formal requirement of the program. So the European Commission will actually post this webinar on their website, and it will be available also to people who haven't had a chance to attend it. We apologize for relatively late marketing. As I said, we are finishing this current round of EaSI, but yeah, it will be available both through the EU website, but also MFC and our partners' websites.
And let's go to the next slide, and we'll start.
Okay, so super. So finally, let's get to the let's dig into the webinar and to the topic. So we would like to give you as introduction an overview of what sustainable finance is, and then present the EIB Group framework, and also dive to EIB's standard 11 on intermediated finance. And then we will also, as you know, EIB Group consists of both EIB and EIF. There is also European Investment Bank Institute involved. So the financial intermediation is conducted through EIB and EIF. So we'll also discuss the EIF's ESG principles and policy framework. And then, if there is interest, we'll also spend time on answering your questions. So let me present the EIB Group experts. So we have two of them. We are lucky to have actually two. Paula Baldomero Zazo, who is sustainability expert at European Investment Bank. And Paula has 15 years of experience working for both international organizations and the private sector, focusing on financial intermediation and their social and environmental impact. Paula currently works as a sustainability specialist in the Environment, Climate and Social Office at the European Investment Bank, where she works on the implementation of the ES standards for financial intermediaries. And we also have Paula Ruiz Martin, who is mandate officer at the European Investment Fund. And Paula Ruiz has more than 10 years of experience in the financial and sustainable development fields, working for the private sector and international organizations. And Paula currently works at the EIF as a mandate officer of social impact programs, developing and implementing EU financial instruments, and additionally, she's involved in EIF's policy, ESG, and climate-related cross-cutting projects. So super that Paula, you join us for this, and the floor is yours.
Moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Give me a minute. Okay, stop. I need to add our.
Okay, so we have.
We need to share another
break just to share the screen.
Moment.
With the presentation. And before we start, maybe Paula, you can address this this topic that this issue that I mentioned before we began, and that is why is the governance component missing in the title. What is that? The reason why I'm asking is because usually we know those framework as ESG, environmental, social, and governance framework. So maybe you can give us a hint why it's not in the title of this, and whether we will cover this the governance part in this webinar.
I mean, as part of the EIB Group, we have both the EIB and the EIF. So in the EIB part, we separate more the environmental and the social from the governance, because we do more project finance, and then for us, more project finance, more infrastructure, big corporates. So we actually need a full dedicated team to be looking at those aspects of compliance, and actually also the environmental and the social aspects are more have a more of a weight on their own, right? When you are looking at infrastructure projects, these are aspects that require dedication per se. In the case of EIF, and I will let Paula complement, is all the non-financial aspects, all the non-financial considerations. And that is why governance is probably included in that, although they do have a dedicated team looking at compliance and other aspects. But I think the weight of the environmental and social, it's not that big, because they only work through intermediated financing. And so it doesn't merit a full department in itself. Do you see what I mean? So the non-financial aspects are more or less grouped together as part of the principles. And maybe Paula, feel free to complement, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, if I may add, of course, the EIB group framework in general, as Paula has explained, is mainly covering environmental and social, whereas the EIF ESG principles are focused on the three work streams. Nevertheless, we also have a dedicated team looking into compliance and legal topics, let's say, whereas the environmental and social topics are covered through different departments. What I see also is that there is governments have been more successful into incorporating governance aspects in the regulation. Hence, this part has evolved more rapidly than the environmental and social part, and this is why we need to develop specific and dedicated frameworks from the private companies in order to tackle for these risks and opportunities that might not be so captured in the regulation, although lately we have seen that we are also advancing in these fields.
Super, thanks. That's pretty clear. I think we are now ready with the presentation. So, Paula, right?
Yes, I will start, and then Paula will focus on the EIF framework. So, I mean, here just as to set up the scene a little bit, right? We all know that climate change it's changing the world we live in. It's having a incredible impact on the temperatures that we are facing. The average temperatures are increasing, and but it's also having an impact on biodiversity, on the livelihoods of people, on the ecosystems that provide us a lot of services and that are helping us maintaining a healthy and productive life. So to curb emissions and to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030, and to be able to slow climate change, we also need to protect the environment. We need to recover ecosystems, and the point is that we need to do all of this in a very inclusive manner, not to leave any sectors of the population behind, and to have a fair transition. And for that, sustainability is really at the core of the solution to all these challenges. The problem is that we really need trillions of euros, and I mean trillions of euros. And then to be able to do all those changes, public resources are clearly not enough. And especially because at the speed that we need all those investments, the public resources and the governments are not able to fuel all that money. But what we really need is to engage the private sector. The financial sector needs to be playing a very essential role in implementing all those ambitions in the environmental, in the climate, and also for the social sustainability objectives of the European Commission and basically for international initiatives like the Sustainable Development Goals. But what it means per se is that the financial sector needs to change and needs to become more sustainable. And for the next slide, here, what we need to understand is basically what, the previous one, sorry, what is sustainable finance? It was the previous, voila. So here, what we need to understand basically is what is sustainable finance. And in the end, it just means that we are having to consider and integrate in our decisions and our investment decisions other considerations that are not purely financial. So it means that we have to take into account the environmental, the social, and the governance, both from the risk side and from the impact side. So it means that when we are assessing the risk profile of a potential investee company, we would need to have into account environmental aspects like climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, things like the preservation of biodiversity or the pollution prevention. In terms of social considerations, we need to think of inequality, inclusiveness, even labor relationships, or, in certain geographies, if we're talking about human rights issues. And for the governance, we need to think about what is the governance structure of the investee companies, the management structures, the employee relationship, or even like the executive remuneration. So if the incentives are properly aligned with the long-term goals of the company. So here is the key word, the long-term. We need to focus on the long-term healthiness of a company, just not looking at the 3 last years of revenues and profits. It's like, we need to focus on what is it that's sustainable in the long term. And then why sustainable finance is important is because we really want to achieve a long-lasting changes in our economies. We need to actually go beyond what it means the next 5 years, and we need to think on the next 10, for example, for achieving the climate goals. And we need to also achieve better societal impacts and outcomes, right? Because if we do not change the way the financial system works, we will not be able to make the transition to economies that are low carbon and that are better for societies. So the point is that the sustainable finance is important for financial institutions also, not just because of the impacts that they're having, but also because they mean risks for the financial institutions. And here I would like the next slide, if possible. Voila, perfect. So the risk, no, previous one, sorry, on the risks. Sorry, I don't know if I'm going too slow or too fast, but so here the key is to consider how the environmental and the social impacts and risks that the companies are facing can also affect the financial situation of a financial intermediary, and how those risks can go all the way up to the financial intermediary. So, for example, we have to consider that if a company doesn't manage its environmental and social risk, they could be subject to fines, they could lose market share, or they could, for example, there could be some disruptions to their operations if they lose the permits or environmental licenses. So these risks at the company level translate for the financial institution into direct risks. For example, if the intermediary is a shareholder of the company, then they may have some liability risk that they need to pay for fines themselves, or I don't know, there could be some financial cost for the intermediary. But there are also indirect risks like reputational risk or credit risk. For example, if the company is subject to fines or they cannot operate because they've lost their environmental permit, they will not be able to repay their loans. So all these risks and considerations need to be included in the credit risk analysis that the financial intermediary makes. And those, they really need to be properly assessed, and there needs to be some knowledge to that, right? Some standards and benchmarks that need to be applied. So now, yes, the next slide. So what about EIB? So EIB is, in the end of the day, it's a bank, right? So we ourselves are applying the sustainable finance practices. And we started with integration of environmental and social aspects very back then in 1994, although the first principles were established in 2009. And the standards per se that we apply to our operations, they were initially 10 standards, and they were established in 2013. In the in the framework that we're presenting today is the revised framework that includes a new policy. It includes 11 standards instead of 10, and it also includes the EIF ESG principles. And then we will have the procedures that will be published down the road. But for now, the publications include the policy and the standards. And the next slide, please. So basically, the framework is composed by the policy, and it really focuses on the transitions to the economies that are going to be climate resilient, that are low carbon, but also with a long-term view to support the transition for families and citizens, that they are able to keep on, making a living out of these new economies and new way of doing business, right? So the policy, again, it's part of the affects both the EIB and the EIF, although the standards are specifically applied to the EIB operations only, because as I mentioned earlier, the type of operations and businesses that EIB finances are very different from the ones that EIF finances. So the standards that I will explain, and I will go very fast over them because many of those don't apply to microfinance. So it's just to get an overview and an understanding of what type of standards we're talking about. So the standards, including standard 11 on intermediated finance, apply to the EIB finance operations, and then the ESG principles apply to the EIF operations. And on the next slide, please. So the policy, it's more of again, a policy document that explains what are the objectives, how is our strategy, and how these are driven by the idea of promoting sustainable and inclusive development. And basically, it's more of a vision of how we're going to be doing things in this coming decade until 2030, and how the sustainable finance approach is really at the core of everything. Now we can move to the standards, if you like. The next slide. Perfect. Yes, perfect. So the standards are basically 10 standards that apply to all the operations from EIB, and then standard 11 is focused on intermediated finance. So also standard 8 and 9 that we will see on the next slide apply to financial intermediaries at the level of the intermediary, not so much at the level of the finance companies under under the intermediated finance business. So the first standard is basically what it's doing. It's setting up the framework or the overall approach to analyzing the environmental and social risk of an operation. So it's basically an integrated approach that takes into account environmental, including climate, and the social impacts and risks, and how it defines the responsibilities of the project promoters and how these risks should be assessed, managed, and monitored. The main change from the previous standard is that it clarifies more or less how to incorporate the human rights considerations in the assessment. And it just gives how we are going to implement it gives a view of how we're going to implement the human rights within the overall process. The second standard is also very much related to infrastructure projects. So here this standard provides an approach for stakeholder engagement, which means how we can have meaningful interactions and consultations with the communities that are being affected by a particular project. You can imagine if you are building a bridge, and then there needs to be some communities that are displaced for whatever reason, or I don't know, there needs to be something built very close to the community. So this means this standard really provides such an approach of how this stakeholder engagement needs to be done properly. There needs to be a grievances system in place, and that the EIB can take some complaints from if the local institutions are not capable to process all of the grievances and resolve all the problems that are brought up by a project that EIB has taken part. Sorry. The third standard is focusing on resource efficiency and pollution prevention. So it basically promotes a sustainable use of raw materials, including energy, for example, and it really looks at how we can minimize the impacts on the human health from the emissions to air, water, and soil. It's really especially important to avoid or minimize the use of, the hazardous waste and chemicals and pesticides. So it's giving a guidance on how we can improve the resource efficiency for the projects. Now, this new standard, the key change is that it is introducing the principles of circular economy and a life cycle assessment of the products that are being involved or produced or produced by the companies or the projects. Standard 4 focuses on biodiversity and ecosystems. So the goal or the aim of the standard is to promote the protection and conservation of biodiversity, and then also the sustainable management of living resources like plants, trees, and forests. The key change is that before this standard was accepting that there was some loss of biodiversity, but then there would be some offsets or compensations for the biodiversity loss. For example, if a project, there was no alternative but to put a project into to a protected area. So there could be some biodiversity loss, some trees that are, or some important biodiversity animals, or like some important things that are being lost, but then there needs to be compensation. So there would be the same trees planted or extended in another part of the protected area. But this is something that has completely changed, and now the goal is to have no biodiversity loss whatsoever. And really the compensation or the offset, it's really a last resort. Then for standard 5, we're focusing on the climate change, and it really promotes climate considerations in all the projects. Here we're talking both mitigation and adaptation. So it's really to every single project that is financed by EIB needs to consider how can it be improved, or how can it be aligned to the Paris Agreement and the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And all those principles need to be taken into consideration in each project. Here, the update is coming from the fact that we have put in place the EIB Group Climate Bank Roadmap. So now all transactions need to be Paris aligned. And there are clear requirements for project risk to include the climate dimension into the project risk analysis. So also this means that sometimes there needs to be adaptation aspects that need to be taken into consideration.
And Paola, could I interrupt?
Yes.
I wanted to ask.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask. Maybe it's not clear for everyone, but if
Yes.
EIB, for instance, works with a financial intermediary, do these standards apply to the institution itself, do they also apply to the clients, to
No,
companies they finance? Both.
So all these standards I mentioned until standard 8 and 9 do not really apply to intermediaries. So it's more of a framework that would allow us to understand what we want the intermediaries to do. So these are standards that work as a reference for us to when we look at what the financial intermediary does, how they analyze the ENS risks and impacts of a financial intermediary, our reference point will be the standards. So we will want, in a way, to the financial intermediary to apply these standards, but in a commensurate way. So we will not ask them to have, extensive biodiversity analysis for a, small mom and pop shop that it's, getting a 20,000 loan. That's not the case. But in a way, we want them to think on what happens with the pollution, if they can, if there are some resilience or adaptation measures that the small businesses can also take into account, right? So the bank needs to put themselves in our shoes, to replace EIB in doing this kind of assessment. But it will be obviously commensurate to the size of the risks, right?
Yeah.
So for example, if you are a small restaurant in front of the sea, so maybe your business will not affected by the rising seas in the next 5 years, but maybe in the 10, 15 coming years, it's something that maybe the bank can help the businesses start thinking about it, right? They need to start potentially thinking what is it that they can do to become more resilient. So those are reference points for the intermediaries to start thinking like EIB. You see my point?
So this is basically the context for your investments in the field.
Exactly. So this is more for EIB, how we apply what we want our projects to be doing, but we're talking about large projects. So maybe I can, if you think it's a bit confusing, I can jump maybe to the next slide. And also,
if I could ask participants to ask questions through the chat function, please. If you have any questions, you can simply write them down and send via chat. So we can, every now and then, we can maybe take a few and answer.
That's why I wanted to go very quickly, because most of these standards don't apply. And then, for example, standard 6, we're talking about, again, an infrastructure project. That means that there needs to be some land acquisition, then some communities need to be displaced. And the key is that these communities, the ideal is that they agree to be, resettled. But if they don't agree, then there needs to be a very clear process to make sure that the resettlement is well done. So next slide, if you like, please. So standard 7, it's also basically try to propose an approach on how to, when vulnerable groups, indigenous communities are affected by a project, how they can be properly, assess what are the impacts and what are the best solutions to bring to the indigenous communities, for example. Then standard 8 and 9, they do apply to financial intermediaries, to the intermediary itself. Like, so the point is that, the intermediary has to ensure that the proper labor rights are respected and given to their own employees. And then on standard 9 is that also that health and proper health, safety and security work conditions are in place for their own employees. And then on standard 11, I think we can just jump right to the standard 11 like this. People will understand that what applies to the financial intermediaries that obtain financing from EIB is standard 11. And then the 8 and the 9 at the level of the employees. But the standard 11, what it does is just trying to analyze and make sure that the financial intermediary has in place the processes to take into consideration the environmental, climate, and social impacts of their operations and the risks that the investee companies are bringing to the financial intermediary. Is this what the Commission, the European Commission, calls this the double materiality? Is the impacts from the operations to the world and the risks that the environmental, social, and climate brings to the business of the intermediary. So the point is that we need to make sure that the financial intermediary has in place the processes for assessing the risks, managing the risks, and monitoring the risks and the impacts. So if there are some impacts, those impacts needs to be mitigated. Again, this is also covering all type of financial intermediaries. So here we're talking about investment banks, we're talking about SMEs, and we're talking about microfinance. But the requirements that we impose to the financial intermediary are fully commensurate with the size of the impacts and the risks. So if you go to the next slide, here we're focusing more on what it means for microfinance, right? So this, yes? Sorry, I don't know if there was a question. No? Okay, I'll keep going. So, so again, the key is that we understand that the impacts and the risks are going to depend on the size of the companies that are receiving the financing. So when we're talking about micro enterprises, those impacts, those risks are going to be much smaller. And also the micro enterprises or the small businesses are going to have a smaller capacity to manage and assess the risks and be able to implement mitigating measures. So the point is that the FI has to have the process in place to understand what are the risks and the impacts. And then once they are in place, then they need to ensure that the final beneficiaries or the micro enterprises also have a way to manage the risk. So for example, we need to make sure that the micro enterprises comply with the law, right? That they are complying with environmental and social laws. So if you are a small workshop that requires an environmental permit for your business because you are handling chemicals or anything like this, then that the permits are in place, for example, right? These are small checks and balances that the financial intermediary needs to take into consideration to make sure that eventually that micro enterprise is not going to have a big fine or have some trouble in their operations because of environmental and social considerations. So these are a bit, the lightest approach that we can have, but still having into consideration what are the potential risks and impacts from the environmental and social considerations. But then what is key, of course, in the microfinance sector is the social impacts, because we're working with vulnerable groups, population. So what is really key and what EIB is going to ensure is that there are strict client protection principles that are followed by the microfinance institutions. So we need to make sure that, for example, that the intermediary is following the best practices in terms of, avoidance of over-indebtedness, price transparency, all of the probably requirements that are included in the European Code of Good Conduct already, and that many MFIs are already obtaining certifications or audits that they are following the client protection principles. So that would be the main pillar of our assessment as EIB, to ensure that the social aspects are well protected and that the clients of the intermediaries are well protected by the best practices. But in terms of process and how we are going to ensure that, how EIB is going to do a due diligence on the processes of the intermediaries, it's going to be a very basic step approach, which is we will have a due diligence questionnaire for asking the right questions about the processes and the procedures, and understanding how the FI takes into consideration the environmental and social aspects. Then, if there are things that EIB considers that needs to be improved in terms of the risk management practices of the FI, then we will put in place an action plan. But that action plan will not be in the vacuum. There will be probably some technical assistance available to support the improvements of the environmental and social management system. That is the technical word. And then what it's for sure going to happen is that there will be some contractual requirements for both the FI and to pass on to the final beneficiaries some contractual requirements to comply with environmental and social laws, which is already part of the current practice and in EIB. So I hope I didn't confuse people more than what they were at the beginning. And all those principles, don't get scared. It's just more of a framework for the intermediary to understand what are the important standards that need to be considered, but it's never at that scale that will apply to a microfinance institution. That's for sure.
Although, as you already mentioned, the Code of Good Conduct, I think it's also worth mentioning that availability of the EU financial instruments for microfinance is actually contingent on being evaluated and then certified on this European Code of Good Conduct.
So that's already a big safeguard for us, a big how can I say, a big safeguard to ensure that the processes are going to be in place, that there is already a good risk management in place.
Yeah, super. And I also wanted to make a point for those of you who actually happen to be from the microfinance field, for whom this webinar is actually for whom we are organizing this event, this webinar, is that it's important not to confuse the concept of financial sustainability, which is quite popular in microfinance, with the concept of sustainable finance, because these are two different things. Financial sustainability is more of a term that allows us to capture to what extent a financial institution such as microfinance institutions can cover its expenses with its own financial income, excluding all of the donations, all of the grants, even adjusting for inflation. So it's more of a financial term, while here when we talk about sustainable finance, it is a broad term that, except for the financial aspects, also incorporates those other environmental, social, and governance aspects of the institution. So let's not confuse these two terms. But anyway, thank you very much, Paula. And over to Paula to discuss the EIF ESG principles.
Thanks a lot, Gregor. If I could complement to what you were saying about the financial sustainability, in a sense, what we are saying with these principles is that applying environmental, social, and governance practices also helps to ensure the financial sustainability of intermediaries and also to final recipients. Yeah.
Absolutely, because it also makes us alert to certain risks that exist, just within this field of social or environmental protection, as Paula already mentioned that. Yeah, super. Thank you for this.
Indeed, indeed. So first of all, thank you very much for having organized this webinar around EIBG ESG practices. I think that it is very timely now that we have launched a new wave of products. InvestEU call for expression of interest was launched in April, and we have a dedicated product for microfinance and social entrepreneurship, which is the successor of EaSI. And I've seen that you are also organizing a webinar around that this week.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot to you for your work, for being a vehicle to share good practices and to strengthen and inspire the social community. Through this 15-minute presentation, I'm going to guide you through the ESG principles and in general the ESG framework that applies to the EIF and its counterparts. I will also mention some particularities that apply to microfinance and some considerations also on the positive side of the agenda. Next slide, please. So very quickly, for the ones that are not familiarized with EIF type of activity, we operate in an intermediated model, and although we have our own resources, we mainly manage and implement mandates that other institutions entrust us, mainly the EIB, the European Union through the European Commission, and local authorities and MPIs. So we are in charge of implementing financial instruments that address EU policy priorities. We roll out products to the market, equity and debt risk-sharing instruments that target funding gaps. And we enter into operations with financial intermediaries. And so far, we have worked with more than 600 funds and 400 banks. And thanks to this whole process, we finance mainly SMEs, but also mid-caps and individuals. And we transform, on average, each euro of public resources into 5 euros actually invested in final recipients. Next slide, please. But what brings us here today is a different topic, the ESG practices of the EIF. The EIF has in place for itself and for its counterparts. Our first EIF ESG principles were launched in 2017 and have been updated recently this year in order to complement the EIBG environmental and social policy. And also, of course, to include best practices that have appeared in the latest years. As you know, this is a very active industry. And luckily, we see that if you can go back and we have just the EIF ESG principles and the other part. Well, it's fine. So as Paula has explained, this EIBG environmental and social policy recalls the environmental and social objectives and principles embedded in EU treaties, in the fundamental rights, in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, and related policies, international agreements, and so on. And on that basis, it sets out our vision as a group on the importance of taking a balanced view of the climate, environmental, and social part with the economic dimension of sustainable and inclusive finance, in a sense. The old EIF principles reflected this overarching vision, and this is also the reason why we have updated them, because now that we have this policy that applied to the whole group, now the principles are somehow describing a more operational approach of the principles guiding the assessment, management, and reporting of environmental, climate, and social risks and matters related to the EIF and its transactions. Again, Gregor has anticipated a bit to what I was saying, because here I've mentioned the ECS instead of the ESG, because as I've said before, we see that maybe in the near future, the industry also changes this acronym, because governments have been able to implement the governance practices in the regulation. Of course, ESG principles, as the name says, include governance good practices such as compliance with law clauses, include environmental and social laws, of course, counterparty integrity, anti-fraud and anti-tax avoidance, non-complying jurisdiction, and so on. But we are incorporating then on top of the E and S, the C, because this is a more important topic in general, is being separated from the environment, let's say, overall topic, because as, for example, the EU taxonomy for sustainable finance, the climate part has been developed before the environmental part. And of course, for us as the European Climate Bank, this is an important topic to isolate and to pay attention to when we are thinking about how we want our business to be developed. So as you can see in the different blue spots, we are carrying out an ESG assessment during the due diligence. We have an updated list of excluded and restricted sectors. We have the Climate Bank roadmap that Paula has previously mentioned, in which we are setting ambitious goals with respect to supporting the transition to a low carbon economy. We are supporting our intermediaries to become Paris aligned. We are reporting according to the best practice, for example, set out in the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We have implemented a system to identify incidents, which is called RepRisk. We have become members of the PRI, and we are reporting according to their system. What else am I missing? Yeah, we have a new methodology for identifying the climate risk exposure of our portfolios. So we have a number of initiatives and points that we are covering in these ESG principles. I have not been comprehensive in the description of them, but I just wanted to provide you with an overall background of what we are thinking here. Finally, specifically for microfinance, as you have also mentioned before, for banks, we are requiring them to endorse the European Code of Good Conduct for microcredit provision. And in case of non-banks, they have to comply with it. And this provides us also with a lot of comfort when we are implementing the other parts, because this sets the standard quite high with respect to the previous items. Next slide, please. So this is another way to looking at all the points that I've mentioned before. There are some principles that apply at product level and mandate level, and others that apply at transaction level. So as you can see here, we have the EIF public policy goals, which are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I will speak about this at the later part of the presentation. Then we have these restricted sectors and activities, transparency and best market practices, and reporting and disclosure. These three ones also apply at transaction level. On the ESG DD, Paris alignment, climate risk, ESG transaction monitoring. So not only pre-selecting the intermediary, but also post on a reporting basis. And then, of course, the compliance with law and regulation, which is the basis for everything. Next slide, please. So here we have them explained. I wanted to provide you with the three different views on which are the overall principles, what are, how are they applied through the products and through specifically the operations, and then from a stage focus, how we do all these things. So the ESG due diligence is essentially conducted through a dedicated questionnaire, which aims at evaluating different points. The ESG risk profile, the ESG policies and practices, including a focus on diversity and inclusion, and another one on climate change, and which is the governance structure. Then the integration of ESG factors in the investment or decision making, or investment or lending decision making, and on the stewardship role, which is mainly applicable to equity. As well, of course, with regards to internal monitoring and control. Then the outcome of this ESG questionnaire is summarized in an internal ESG score that enables us also, the EIF, to make a decision on the operation to progress in the pipeline or not. Then at the level of the Paris alignment of counterparties, we want to support our intermediaries on their pathways to align with the Paris Agreement. This is, let's say, a more stringent approach. So it's only focusing on the intermediaries that are bigger in terms of size and resources, but also in terms of which is the impact in the portfolio with regards to CO2 emissions. So we are applying this specific part of the ESG questionnaire to institutions that have financial institutions that have more than 30 billion in total assets and who are among the 3 largest in the country. And for fund managers with assets under management of more than 500 million. Of course, sovereign, sub-sovereigns, as well as microfinance, business angels, current institutions, and so on, are out of scope. I mean, mainly because they don't reach this threshold, but also because we wanted to have a proportionate approach to this type of institutions which do not have the same impact and the same resources to implement ESG high standard practices, let's say. Then on Paris alignment, exclusions and restrictions, which is already at the level of the signature. So when we are already drafting the contract or the side letter with the FI that has been already selected by the EIF, we have an approach that is aligned to EIBs, and here we have also a proportionate restriction for inclusive finance, including also not only microfinance institutions, but also social finance lenders or other institutions that have social enterprises as a target group in the portfolio. And this proportionate approach mainly is aligned to the EIB energy lending policy restriction, but we are not adding all the requirements, let's say, that we apply for other institutions. Now that climate is very relevant for our institution, for activity, we have also a list of eligibility principles for climate action and environmental sustainability. So in order to understand how much we're contributing to these thematics, to these topics, we are including a percentage of CA and ES, of climate action and environmental sustainability, that the intermediary is going to dedicate. And this is, of course, tracked, exposed. On the post-signature, as I've mentioned before, we have these repris that enable us to identify potential impacts and incidents at the level of the portfolio and the intermediary, and we run this tool on a daily basis. And of course, through our reporting and our sustainability reporting in general, we are including information to our mandators and internally for the EIF purposes with regards to green transactions and other elements. And finally, we have this climate risk screening tool that enabled us to understand which is the climate exposure of the EIF in terms of transition and physical risk. Next slide, please. Yes.
So Paula, if I could ask, so for a microfinance institution, if you could again maybe say which of these principles they would have to. Which of these principles would apply to MFIs, since they are small institutions? You mentioned.
Yes, so
not necessarily.
All these apply except for the Paris alignment of counterparties.
Sorry, if, for instance, is intending to sign a contract for guarantee instruments, let's say an institution in Romania and or France, and so what does the ESG principles mean to them? You know, just which of these things they will have to comply with in order to sign the agreement?
It means that taking into account all the elements that I've described, they are going to be included in the contracts. There is a proportionate approach with respect to the EIF restricted and excluded sectors, and the Paris alignment of counterparty does not take place. But for the rest, the rest is applicable. And as I've said before, mainly the ESG questionnaire is the way in which we screen and assess and identify the potential risk of financial intermediaries. So in a sense, apart from the contractual clauses that we may add in our contracts to cater for the compliance with law and the compliance with our frameworks, we have an ESG questionnaire in which we are asking about which are the policies, which are the practices, the processes in place with regards to ESG.
Okay.
And then, of course, depending on the mandate that we're using, we would have a different requirements in terms of reporting and monitoring.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah. So as I've mentioned before, we have launched InvestEU. Recently, we have the call of expression of interest since April available in our website for all the intermediaries that want to apply to the product. On the guarantee side, we have 6 products. One, it's on microfinance and social entrepreneurship, which is the successor of EaSI. Here, on top of what we do, we have a sustainability proofing requirement that includes some additional clauses with respect to specific sectors that are more risky. For example, the projects that entail an environmental impact assessment, or as an example, I give you the sector of anaerobic digestion. There are some clauses that I haven't brought here because they're quite legalistic, and they are quite a lot regarding these sectors. But for microfinance, it won't be an issue, and it won't stop them for financing or providing the same type of support to final recipients as what they're doing now. The sustainability proofing requirement entails some reporting requirements on our side, and also to assess the applicant's environmental, climate and social risk management procedures and the capacity to screen, assess and manage environmental, climate and social risks. So we have to check, in a sense, if the FI has an environmental and social management system by means of this ESG questionnaire that I've mentioned during the selection process. Next slide, please. So what I've mentioned during this part of the presentation is on the left hand side of the slide. So through our ESG framework that we are applying for all activities during due diligence, we are doing that not only because it's a priority for the union, but also because it enhances the traditional financial analysis by identifying potential ESG risk and opportunities that may hamper in the long run the financial sustainability of intermediaries and of final beneficiaries. So we are mainly focusing on the negative side of the screening, but we are also trying to incorporate good practices with regards to, for example, engagement or the provision of additional financing on environmental and social related areas. And in this sense, we are aiming at generating returns alongside understanding which are the ESG risk intrinsic in the financing activities. On another side, as I was mentioning at the beginning of the presentation, with regards to the positive side of the agenda, we also are trying to become more thematic driven. So historically, the EIF has mainly focused on providing financing to SMEs without a dedicated topic or focusing on specific sectors. Now we are doing that. So we are targeting investment that have a specific thematic approach that is aligned with EU priorities on top of the SME strategy, for example. So as an example, the gender strategy. So under InvestEU, we're trying to incorporate gender KPIs, for example. And these EU priorities have been mapped internally to the Sustainable Development Goals. In case of equity, just to provide you with an example, this can take form of impact investing. So committing to achieve funds need to commit to achieve a measurable and positive and non-financial impact. And this is linked to the remuneration of the manager, to the carried interest. So the manager will receive a higher remuneration in case they comply with the specific social and environmental KPIs. Next slide, please. So very briefly, I wanted to touch on the EIF public policy goals that are driving the way we're raising and developing products with our mandators. Normally and historically, we have focused on the competitiveness and growth one, a bit on innovation, also a bit on social. Now we are extending the social the social scope also, for example, with skills and education and culture and creativity type of investments, but also this new pillar on the green side with regards to sustainability and green transformation. Specifically, microfinance and social enterprises financing for us is incorporated in the two first policy objectives that you can see in the screen in the pink, let's say, line, inclusion, diversity, and well-being, and impact and social innovation. And if you can go to the next slide, please. What we have done is to map all our operations and transactions to the Sustainable Development Goals, so the UN Agenda for 2030. As you might know, there are 17 SDGs and 169 SDG targets. We have mapped our type of intervention to 49 SDGs out of these 169. And for example, when we are committing to provide support to a financial intermediary that operates in the microfinance or social entrepreneurship segment, we understand that we're having an impact on SDG 8, and which is related to decent growth and decent job and growth creation, and on reduced inequalities, SDG 10, but also to SDG 1, and specifically one of the SDG targets that are linking this ambitious agenda with microfinance is target SDG target 1.4, which says that by 2030, we should ensure that all men and women, in particular the poor and the vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources, as well as access to basic services, ownership and control over land and other forms of property, inheritance, natural resources, appropriate new technology and financial services, including microfinance. No? So we see that there is a specific link to microfinance here, and we are about to publish our report with regards to SDGs for the first time of the EIB Group together, because EIB published theirs last year. So we will see the impacts also of the microfinance market and the operations that the EIF is dedicating to the segment there. So now I think we open the floor to any questions you may have, also on the first part of the presentation from Paula or on my side.
Yeah. So super. That was great. Thank you, Paula, and thank you also for showcasing how those public policy goals actually link with SDGs, which is the meta context for our considerations and actions. In fact, I just wonder if there are any questions from the audience. Again, feel free to either fill up the chat function or just raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. We'll allow you to speak. I wanted to ask both of you, just to what extent the regulation should also look into those ESG frameworks, and should it at all, and whether examples of any countries where actually just regulation incorporates at least some aspects of those ESG frameworks. You mentioned regulation in a couple of contexts, but I thought I would also ask you, just to what extent this is also a regulatory concern.
I can start, and Paula, you complement. So basically, the regulation is already starting to move, right? With all the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan, with the taxonomy, I mean, maybe it doesn't still apply to the microfinance market segment directly, but there is more and more regulation to be concerned about, and more reporting and disclosures regulation on non-financial aspects. So, you know, depends on the size of the banks. Even banks nowadays are already starting to report on non-financial aspects. I mean, they have been for a while, right? But the new regulations, like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is going to lower the threshold and is going to apply to more companies in Europe. So maybe potentially, if it's a medium to large MFI, it may have to start already reporting on their impacts and the risk and how they manage the climate risks, for example. So there is a lot of already regulation going public and being adopted by the EU and sometimes even the national national governments. So,
And I would add
the
that
trend that will not
indirectly,
stop. Sorry, Paula.
yeah, indirectly, as also EIB, EIF, and all the multilateral banks are raising the standards because of this new regulation, then there might be in some fields not a direct impact to these institutions, but an indirect impact because their lenders are also implementing this new regulation and are increasing the requirements and the standards for the finance, for providing financing.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because, for example, ourselves, EIB, will have to report on the green asset ratio, right? So we will have to look at our portfolio, look at how we are investing in EIB our monies, and then be able to classify what it is green, what it's not green. You know, if there is some MF, including of course, our investment in the financial intermediaries. So we will have to be able to classify, look at it, and understand whether it's taxonomy aligned and whether it can be considered green investment, right? So for us, as Paula rightly pointed out, whatever affects us is going to affect our clients. So.
And I would say that more and more the social dimension and environmental dimensions are more linked. So we are seeing that a lot of banks that are asking for our guarantee support in the scope of EaSI and the new microfinance and social guarantee product under InvestEU, they might be also providing loans and financing to final recipients that are in the field of climate and environment. Hence, this will also trigger from our side. We would like to report that we are financing this green contribution. So in a sense, if they might be being financed through a green product, we might require them for different reporting fields related to the thematic.
Super. And just more general question about just, is this leading to some sort of a new paradigm in economics? Just like when you think the neoclassical economy, and especially in its much criticized neoliberal liberal model that was part of our lives for 30 years, and it seems that it's not as maybe it's still important, but I think governments and institutions and think tanks, universities are looking for ways of influencing this current paradigm so that it's more human and it includes all these other aspects of life that were kind of ignored by neoliberalism. So do you think this is an exit route from it? Is it an entry point to a new economic paradigm that's a little bit more human, that means economy more for people and for the environment? What's your view on this?
Paula, if you like, I mean, I'm taking over all the time first, but go ahead. You want to? To me,
Go ahead, I can compliment.
Yeah, no, to me, it's just, it was never sustainable. A principle, like a paradigm in which it's always growth that drives the decision making.
Profit,
It's always about expanding and growing. I mean, when you have a limited planet, right? When you have limited resources. So it did not make sense to not look at the natural resources that we depend very much on. And those are limited. They are renewable, but they renew at a certain pace, and they renew it at a certain scale. So it's just, we are just realizing that the models that we had based our economic systems don't work. And it doesn't mean that we don't need to allow people to keep on, you know, improving their lives, but you cannot just keep on accumulating and not taking into consideration that the resources are limited, that the pace at which they renew is very limited. So it's just, it's a matter of surviving now. It's not really even, you know, I don't know how to say it, like looking at it from a super ego or like a philosophical perspective. It's just a matter of surviving and being able to sustain the life and the amount of people that we are, right? Probably those systems were also invented in a time in which the world seemed very big and that there were very few people. But now it's just, you know, it's not something that can be maintained and sustained as it is.
Yeah, to finalize, I totally agree with Paula. I think that we have realized and we are more aware that this implies risks for our lives, for our well-being. So it's not about polar bears not being able to feed. No, it's about us as humans, as a society, encountering with challenges that may jeopardize our way of living and as human beings. No, I would have preferred that the society was aware of this, not because our social system was at risk, but because before identifying that it was a risk for us, but it was a risk for the planet itself. And I don't know if we'll manage to fund these gaps, to cater for these market failures that our economic system has. But I mean, hopefully more and more players in the market start realizing the implications, and not only on the risk side, but also on the opportunity side of implementing all these good practices in their business model, not from a risk perspective, but as an opportunity to cater for a different way of generating economic activity.
Super. No, that was excellent. So maybe it's a good moment to conclude this webinar. So thank you so much, Paula and Paula, for giving us this overview and your opinions, your ideas about where we're moving. I think it's more of an imperative these days to actually include this optics, you know, the lens of environment and of the social impact for any activity on the earth. Not only as Paula you said, because we have a long-term visions and dreams, but it's purely pragmatic. If it's purely pragmatic, it's a matter of almost survival these days. So imperative. Thank you so much. It was great to host you. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of that. As I said, we'll post this the recording on the MFC and the European Commission website, so it will be also available to the people who didn't have a chance to watch it. And we'll see each other at the next installment of this series of end of the month seminar, and it is tomorrow during the webinar on raising awareness of environmental issues among microfinance clients. So let's see how these things that we discussed also work at the end at the beneficiary level. We'll discuss that tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
You too.